and to give you edification and encouragement to continue to shine truth and light in this world. Because as Yeshua, our Lord, said, we are the salt of the earth. You're the light of the world. And so that is who we are, and that is what we want to be. So my prayer is that you will find this information useful. You may not agree with every little thing I say, every little jot or tittle that I say, and that's okay. But the main thing I want to do is really to give you some things for yourself that you can talk about with your lost friends, whether they are Jewish or non-Jewish or atheist or agnostic. The fact of the matter is we live in a continually rapidly declining culture, and it is getting darker by the day. And so if we were making a journey, if we're doing a journey, we want to know where we're going. If we want to know where we're going to go, we need to know where we are. And the question I want to begin with this morning is, where are we as a culture? Where exactly are we? Some of these photographs may seem familiar, some might not seem familiar. The one on the top right is actually in the Iowa, the state of Iowa capital. It's an altar to Satan. That's accurate. It's not a joke. There is an altar to Satan. And of course, the Secretary of Human Services and Health there on the bottom right identifies as a trans woman. And of course, in our White House, it openly celebrates things that God would call sin. So that's where we are. And I would say it this way: we are currently living in a nation that is in open rebellion against God. That is where we are. That's a fact of the matter. We can't sugarcoat it. We can't gloss over it. We are a nation that is running from God. And not only are we a nation running from God, we are also in a culture, living in a culture that is literally at war against truth itself and at war against logic. And this is really even worse off. I mean, it's bad enough that we're in rebellion against God, but we are in a nation, we're in a culture that is in open spiritual war on truth and logic itself. And the psalmist, as he says in Psalm 11:3, when the foundations are being destroyed, what shall the righteous do? When we are living in a culture that the foundations are utterly being destroyed before our very eyes, what do? We pray, obviously, but we also take captive every thought and make it obedient to Christ. George Orwell said it this way. Orwell is famous for his book 1984. He says, "We are now sunk to a depth at which restatement of the obvious is the first duty of intelligent men. In times of universal deceit, telling the truth will be a revolutionary act." Just the fact of telling the truth, you will be considered to be a revolutionary. St. Augustine, the great bishop from North Africa in the 4th century, in his Confessions, when he wrote his Confessions about his testimony, one of the things he did before his conversion is he was a teacher of rhetoric at Milan. Rhetoric may not be familiar to you. Essentially, it was like law. I mean, in the law courts, they would teach people how to make a case. It didn't matter if the truth were involved in the case, as long as you could be flashy in how you said it, that was the most important. And so one of the things that Augustine said, he says, the blindness of humanity is so great that people are actually proud of their blindness. And that was true in the 4th century. Sounds true today as well. Proud of their blindness. In 1948, a brilliant American professor named Richard Weaver, who taught at the University of Chicago for many years. He taught English, and he also did some courses on philosophy. So after 1948, this date may sound familiar to you. This was something that was a lot of Europeans and Americans were sort of struggling with, and that was how could World War II have happened? And a lot of European and American intellectuals began to look at basically Europe was in ashes. There were 6 million Jews dead in the Holocaust. And so they began to scratch their heads thinking, how could this have happened? And in 1948, Richard Weaver published his book called Ideas Have Consequences. What we believe about reality is going to have consequences. And essentially that's what Richard Weaver said. And he looked at Europe between 1930 and 1945, and one of the interesting things that a couple of the interesting conclusions that he came to was that in Germany, before Hitler came to power, in a period called Weimar Germany, A lot of people think today the problem is education. The problem is, well, we just need better education. Well, what we've discovered is in Weimar, Germany, in the 1930s, leading up to the rise of Adolf Hitler, there was a 98% literacy rate in Germany. 98%. And it wasn't just that they were 98% literate, they could read multiple languages and speak multiple languages. So education wasn't the problem. What was the problem? Interestingly, Weaver takes it all the way back to the 14th century to an English philosopher by the name of William of Ockham. And you may have heard of Occam's razor, but Occam is also the father of a philosophy called nominalism. Nominalism, essentially, is an attack on the meaning of words, that words don't apply to reality. And he says that when society begins to decay, you can see how we begin to redefine words. And what are we doing today? We're redefining words. Words don't mean, they can mean whatever you want them to mean. Well, in Germany, a human wasn't necessarily, there were certain people that would measure up to the level of being human. And Jews and those who were in Romania and other parts of the world were not considered to be human. So Germans, the Nazis, could redefine words. Well, where are we in our culture? We are redefining language. And that's what Richard Weaver said. And so the seeds of our potential downfall were sown many, many years ago. The things that we're seeing today in our culture, they just didn't happen overnight. They're not just like mushrooms that popped up overnight after a rainstorm. The things that we're seeing in our culture actually were planted many, many years ago. And what we're seeing is the logical outworking of what philosophies have been implanted in American universities and American culture for the past 40 to 50 years or so. Jefferson said this in 1804. Thomas Jefferson, our second president of the United States, he says, "No experiment can be more interesting than the one we're now trying, in which we trust will end," get this, "in establishing the fact that man may be governed by reason and truth." That was what his hope was, that men may be governed by reason and truth. Well, that was what he thought. And also the other thing that many of the founders have said explicitly or implicitly, and that is this, that America is and was an experiment in reason, an experiment. Can humans be governed? Can they self-govern themselves? And that was what they call the American experiment. And so that's what he said. That's what he means when he says no experiment is more interesting. When we're trying this out. He wrote that in the beginning of the 19th century. Russell Kirk said this in 1992. He said, "It appears to me that our culture labors in an advanced state of decadence, that what many people mistake for the triumph of our civilization actually consists of powers that are disintegrating our culture, that the vaunted democratic freedom of liberal society in reality is servitude to appetites and illusions which attack religious belief, which destroy community through excessive centralization and urbanization, which efface life-giving tradition and custom." And his question that he ponders in this article is, can our nation survive? So let's begin this morning in our morning session. When we're today, really, this morning, the opening session, what I really want to talk about is this something that Orwell mentioned earlier in the Orwell slide, and that is the first duty today of intelligent men is to restate the obvious. Well, people don't believe in obvious truth anymore. Well, we'll begin with our founding documents. Now, what does our Declaration of Independence say? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator. Notice some catchwords there. There's truths, self-evident, Creator, created, there's a creation, that they are endowed, they're given these rights by who? Their Creator. These rights are given by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So the question is this is really what I want to focus on, is this opening line. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Well, what in the world is a self-evident truth? James Shaw said it this way. He's paraphrasing the modern attitude of where we are today in our culture, and I think he's right. This is the Constitution today, or the Declaration today. We hold these truths that no truth can exist. That's one view that we hold today. that all views are created equal. In other words, you can believe contradictory things, that life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness are defined only by ourselves. We get to define what makes us happy. Well, if it makes me happy, then it must be good. They have no objective content. We have nothing in common. Really, there's nothing really that unites us together. You know, we're called the United States, but really, what is it that unites us? Are we really united? No, we're really not. He says this, and again, this is not his view. He's just saying this is the view that today that many people have. Our civic peace exists on the supposition that no truth exists. Therefore, we are all equal in our common acceptance that no truth binds us. The only thing that Shaw says today modern culture believes is that we hold these ideas that you can believe whatever you want to believe, and that's the uniting truth. But that's not what our founding fathers taught, and that's not what they believed. So what are self-evident truths? Well, self-evident truth is what J. Budziszewski, professor of philosophy at University of Texas, Austin, says this: what we can't not know. I know that's a double negative. I get that. But it's what we can't not know. There's no way, it's impossible not to know basic right and wrong. We say, well, I mean, what about people? Yeah, I mean, there are people who do bad things, but they know the good from the bad. And that's what self-evident truth is. It is innate knowledge written on the heart. Written on the heart. And there are biblical precedences for this knowledge, this moral knowledge of moral basic right and wrong. And you've seen the word conscience. But if you look at it, if you look at the English word conscience, if you break it down into its two basic parts, science, what does that mean? With knowledge. You have a conscience. Well, what is that knowledge about? The knowledge of right and wrong, basic right and wrong. But of course, we deny that today. But a self-evident truth is true for all people, for all times, across all cultures. This includes Christians, Jews, Muslims, and even non-believers. There is a truth that is true for everyone, no matter where you come from. So in other words, it's not just Christian truth or Muslim truth or Jewish truth. There's just truth. There's just basic truth. There's no such thing as a truth that has a certain spin to it. There's just truth with a capital T. And that's where we are today. We have to begin with truth. So let me just say this on a practical note. Let me get really practical and pastoral here for a moment. Many of you, and if you have this, if this is true of you, if you would slip your hand up, do you have someone that you know either in your family or you work with or you have an acquaintance, a friend, and they believe somehow that all truth is relative? Slip your hand up. That's pretty much everybody in here that believes that truth is relative. So we're going to hopefully give you some things to dialogue with them about. But let me back up and say this about that person. My prayer for you is that God would continue to use you in their life. And obviously you want them, whether they're of Jewish ancestry or atheist or agnostic, wherever they are, what you want them to know is Jesus. You want them to know Yeshua as their Savior. That's where you want to get them. But before you get them to Yeshua is the risen Messiah of Israel, you have to deal with truth, folks. You got to deal with, does truth exist? Because if there is no such thing as truth, then Yeshua cannot be the Savior for everybody, including them. You have to get past the hurdle of truth. You have to deal with, does truth exist? Before you get to Jesus or anything else, you have to establish whether or not there is such a thing as truth. It is codified in the Old Testament Decalogue, in the 10 words, in the 10 Commandments, which, by the way, is above the chamber of the U.S. Supreme Court, interestingly enough. It'd be nice if they would turn around and read it sometimes, you know. The 10 Commandments. Budziszewski says it this way. There's another way to think of this, that the biblical Decalogue of the 10 Commandments states the most important part of the universal moral code in ideal form. If the anthropological data suggests something short of the ideal, this is not because nothing is universal, but because two universals are in conflict. Universal, what are those two universals? Universal moral knowledge, that people know basic right and wrong, and the universal desire to evade it. To evade it. First, we owe to our creation, and the second to our fall. We are created with God's image. We are made in His likeness, as the Apostle Paul says. We'll look at this in a moment. and that is that we have the moral law written on the heart. God has inscribed the moral law written on the heart. The question is, are people obeying the moral law? They're not. We are in a culture now that is fleeing from the moral law. This is reflected in several of these passages. Isaiah 28, the basic plowman, the guy plowing the field, knows basic right and wrong. It's talked about in Isaiah 28, 23, and 29. Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they display knowledge. We just were treated for a few days ago to the amazing Northern Lights in Chicago, where I live, and I think maybe you guys saw them down here if it was not raining. The heavens declare the glory of God. Romans 1, 18 through 21. Since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly revealed from the things that have been made, so that men are what? Without excuse. They have no excuse. And then the last one is Romans 2, verses 12 through 14. The Apostle Paul, writing to the church of Rome, essentially says that the Romans, these pagan Gentile Romans, they don't have the Ten Commandments. But what does Paul say? They do have the law written where? On their hearts. Their consciences also bearing witness. And so God has written the moral law on the heart. And so people know the basic right and wrong. There are really two witnesses to universal moral truth, and that is creation and conscience. Creation and conscience. There is a God, and there is a moral law. And if we continue to read Romans 1, no one has an excuse. No one can say, well, I didn't know. Well, you kind of did know. You did know. You just rejected. In fact, Paul says in verse 18 and 19 that what do men do? They suppress the truth in unrighteousness. They suppress it in unrighteousness. This suppression of truth is at full swing in our culture. I have one quick story to share about that, about the suppression of truth and how people know right and wrong. And even if someone did not grow up in the church, did not grow up in the synagogue, did not grow up in, a mosque or whatever, people know basic right and wrong. And I heard this story actually in person. I was teaching seminary down in North Carolina, and Dr. Budziszewski, who I quoted earlier, was speaking on the natural law. And so just so you know, University of Texas, Austin is not a Christian school. It's a state school, University of Texas, Austin. He teaches philosophy and constitutional law at the University of Texas. So he's got a PhD in constitutional law and natural law. So the class he was teaching at University of Texas was a class on Supreme Court and the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, this is several years ago. This is back when the U.S. Supreme Court was considering, I think, a case made at the Supreme Court as to whether or not a state could allow a partial birth abortion. Y'all remember that? There was a big debate about that. And partial birth abortion, if you don't want to be graphic, but it's terrible. Basically, the baby's brought almost to full term, and then the baby's allowed to be born while the head is still in the womb, and then the baby is killed before it's finally taken out of the womb. Horrible, horrible thing. So Budziszewski, we're talking about the moral law here and about people knowing right from wrong, knowing that what they're doing is wrong. I'm a very expressive person. I speak with my arms. I don't know if I'm Italian. I'm not, but I like to move around a lot. But he's very, I say that to say that Budziszewski, he's very calm. He almost puts you to sleep. And he explains in the law. So he's not worked up. He's not emotional. In this class, he was talking about, he said, well, this is going to be coming to the Supreme Court. So one of the things they do in law cases is you look at all the data. You look at the science behind it. You look at the arguments for partial birth, and you look at the arguments against partial birth abortion. So in the lecture on constitutional law, this is law students at University of Texas. Many of them were PhDs, many of them are master's degrees. So he's up there calmly explaining, and he finally comes to the part where he has a graphic on. It's not like an actual baby, but it's just a medical journal type image of a partial birth abortion. He's just simply explaining what the procedure is. And he's turned around looking at it, and I'll say he hears a commotion, and he turns around, and one of his students is standing up, screaming profanities at him, and cursing at him, and saying all kinds of horrible things. And he's like, what's going on here? And so she finally stormed out, and people are a little commotion and finally calmed down. He found out later this woman had had multiple abortions, and she had a partial birth abortion. He wasn't condemning her. Who was? The heart. She knew what she did was wrong. She didn't. It's a spring. It's like Brzezinski springs it as that moral law. You suppress it, suppress it, suppress it. We now live in a culture that has been suppressing the truth about what a man is, what a woman is. And we think there's not going to be consequences. We think there's not going to be consequences for, well, you're going to blame the Christians, you're going to blame the Jews, you're going to blame those who say this is wrong. You have people now that are acting out and resulting to violence because their conscience. They don't want anybody, and the churches were not condemning some of these individuals who went in trying to shoot up. There was an individual just in Houston several months ago who had a gun, and so we pray for those people. We pray for that. But the point I'm trying to make here is that there is a moral law, and there is a knowledge of right and wrong, and we know it. And God is given it to us in His Word, very explicitly, but also written on the heart. So we begin with the really basic question of what is truth? What is truth? And that's something that, why do we have to talk about this? But we do. Truth is this. It's that which corresponds to reality. That which corresponds to reality. Who would have ever thought that in 2024 at a conference we have to talk about what is truth? But here we are, and this is what truth is. We have to begin with the basics. Truth is that which corresponds to reality. The foundation of truth in logic is something we call the law of non-contradiction. The law of non-contradiction. Now, in the South where I was brought up, we call this horse sense or common sense, the law of non-contradiction. Two opposite statements cannot both be true at the same time in the same sense. So essentially, again, two opposite things cannot both be true and not true at the same time in the same sense. 2 plus 2 equals 4 is either true or false. It's not both. It's not opinion. It is. It's either true or false. The earth cannot be both round and flat at the same time. Now, I know there are people who believe the earth is flat, but all I'm saying here is that they both can't be true. It can't be both flat like a pancake and round like a basketball at the same time. The other issue is this that we're going to cover here today, and that is either God exists or He does not. There is a God or there's not a God. And if God exists, then that has implications for people's worldview. That has implications for what people believe about reality. And so the law of non-contradiction essentially helps us to discover what is false. Opposite ideas cannot both be true at the same time in the same sense. These two statements, the earth is round, the earth is flat, cannot both be true at the same time in the same sense. Again, to quote Orwell, we now live in an age that we have to restate the obvious. But here we are. These two professors, Professor John Lennox, who I've had the great privilege of having enjoyed a dinner with him twice, and I've never met Richard Dawkins, Oxford. They both teach at, Lennox teaches mathematics, Richard Dawkins teaches biology at Oxford, and of course Lennox is famous for his belief that God exists, and Dawkins, of course, not. So the question is, which one is right? They both can't be right. And I think we live in a culture, again, to where I think that people will just end up saying, because they don't really like to argue, they don't really like conflict, they say, well, maybe both are right. No, they can't both be right. I mean, this is just common sense, folks, Either Dawkins is right or Lennox is right. And of course, we know which one is right. Professor Lennox, who is, by the way, a great defender of the faith. The law of non-contradiction, you'll find, is actually undeniable, even by people who use it. People say there is no such thing as truth. Is that true? You see? So here are some objections that you might get to absolute truth, the fact that there is absolute truth. Here's a few objections. Well, number one, there is no truth. You ever heard that? Or you can't know the truth. No one can really know the truth. All truth is relative. That's true for you, but not for me. That's a famous one that you'll hear a lot. Well, that's true for you, brother. That works for you. I'm glad that you find Yeshua your Messiah. That works for you. But what he's actually saying is that, no, Jesus being the Messiah, risen Savior, is true for everybody. He is risen, and he is your Lord too. But that is an objection you might get with that. Or, no one has the truth. Or, the most famous one, you ought not judge. You know, have you heard that one? So how do we deal with this on a practical level? Well, essentially, your greatest tool in answering these objections is essentially to turn the statement around on itself. So, in other words, if someone says to you, if they say, I cannot speak a word in English. I mean, this is pretty easy, folks. I know if you had your coffee yet, well, is that in English? Obviously it is. I mean, you just contradict yourself. Or there is no such thing as absolute truth. And so all you do is turn the claim around on us. Are you absolutely sure there's no such thing as absolute truth? You see, the statement, there is no such thing as absolute truth, they're saying is a true statement. But if it's true, it's false. Now I know this can give us intellectual constipation, but hopefully not. But basically, if someone says to you, I don't know, no one can know the truth, well, all you do is just say, well, is that true? And they'll say, yes, that is true. Well, if that's true, and if no one can know the truth, then how can you say no one has the truth? Because you apparently know the truth. Maybe you're the only one that has truth. That's not what people mean, though. The other one is, it's true for you, but not for me. Is that true for everybody? That's what you had. Just turn the claim around in itself. It's true for you, but not for me. Of course, they don't mean that. They think it's true for everybody. There's no truth. There's another one. Wasn't on the list earlier, but there's no truth in anything but science. Well, how do you deal with this one? Well, how can you put that statement in a test tube? How can you put that under a microscope? Is that a scientific truth? Is that statement a scientific statement? No, it's not. That's a logical statement. And so that is not a scientific truth. What people have done is they have conflated the scientific method with truth itself. The scientific method is only a tool. It can lead you to the truth, but by in and of itself, it itself is not the truth. So it's not a scientific truth. And the other one is, you ought not judge. Well, of course, that is a judgment. Isn't that a judgment? It is a judgment. Everybody judges. The question is it a judgmental attitude? That's what we're called not to have, is a judgmental attitude toward others. So these are some basic tools that you can use to hopefully get people to think. Well, this is a study done a few years ago by the Central Intelligence Agency. Since we're talking about truth, and the fact of the matter is, if there is no such thing as truth, then not even atheism is true, agnosticism can't be true, nothing can be true if there's no such thing as absolute truth. If it's all just a matter of opinion, then nothing really matters. But people don't actually live that way, do they? They live as if there is absolute truth. And really, let's talk about a very morbid subject, and that is death. This was a study done a few years ago by the Central Intelligence Agency. I think the numbers are still pretty accurate. Every day around the world, 154,000 people will die. Now, when there's not a major war going on. So when you do the math of that, in the United States, 2 people die every second. Six people, 8 people dead. I mean, they're just dying. People are dying. They're entering into eternity. So the question is, these questions are of utmost importance. And every one of us is going to slip into eternity one day. So these questions are really important. And I think, honestly, people are looking for answers. Now, they're looking for solutions in wrong places. They're looking in all types of areas that they think are going to fulfill them. What is the purpose of life? Is it to be happy? Is it to get stuff? Is it to have fun? Is it to be healthy or to be wealthy? Or a big one today, is it to be famous, especially with young people? They want to have their TikTok channel or their YouTube or their Instagram or whatever it is. That's really what they think the purpose of life is. And of course, as we know, the great biblical figure of Solomon, he had everything and found out that it's not all, when you have everything, that's not the end of life. That's not the purpose of life. Well, essentially, these are all correspond to things that really just have no ultimate meaning or purpose. If there really is no God and no truth, then there really is no ultimate purpose at all. there's no purpose. And in fact, several years ago, on my personal blog, I have my Epic Archaeology website, but I also have my personal blog, just me. And I had an article that I wrote in honor of Dr. R.C. Sproul. Some of you may be familiar with him. Dr. Sproul went to be with the Lord several years ago. I got to meet him quite a few years ago, and he actually teaches philosophy and taught from a Christian perspective. And he had a particular view that I really, really like, and it's sort of this, it's almost like this reductionistic view of meaning. And essentially, Sproul's view is this: either there is a God and there is meaning, or there is no meaning whatsoever, and you could just do whatever you want to do. And he's exactly right. And think about this for a second. If you honestly did not believe there was a God, if you didn't believe there was a God, but there's some things you do differently, if there's going to be no judgment, no heaven and hell, I mean, wouldn't you just go, hey, let's just do whatever, you know? That's exactly it. That's essentially what. So the article that I wrote was called, the article was called Atheist Hope. Basically, atheists live as if there is a meaning. They live their life as if there's some kind of meaning to it. But all I want to say is like, oh, wait a minute. Hey, you say there's no God? Yeah, there's no God. Well, then why are you arguing with me on my website, on this blog about God? Why are you so passionate about this idea of being no God? I mean, I was calling, so in the comment section, then I had philosophy professors at major universities were coming in, and they were blogging about my blog. This guy claims, and is this our really claim, and all that, and they were trying to justify all this stuff. And it was like, not checkmate in the sense of I'm better than you, but checkmate in the sense of your worldview is completely bankrupt. Essentially was what I was saying, and I was just saying, all I was saying is just be honest with that. Just own it. If there is no God, then there is no meaning whatsoever. And so I had a couple of guys that I went back and forth with, and we were cordial, but we were very pointed, but very cordial. And I was like, listen, guys, one was a software engineer, PhD from wherever, and we were going back and forth about this meaning. Well, I have meaning. And I was like, that's great. I'm not saying you can't have meaning. I'm saying there's no grounding for your meaning. I mean, ultimately, all your achievements, if you won the Nobel Prize, at the end of the day, so what? I mean, you won the Nobel Prize, in a million years from now, what's it going to matter? It's not going to matter nothing. If someone works on a train, building trains, and someone collects garbage, in a million years, seriously, what does it matter if one won the Nobel Prize and one did not? Well, for that one little microscopic second of time in this earth, they won the Nobel Prize. Well, ultimately, if there's no ultimate meaning and purpose, then there is no meaning at all. And again, they would object to that. But I think that's actually true. There is meaning to this world. So what is a worldview? We really want to talk about what worldviews are to get at making, and really what I want to do today, and the overarching case today is I want us to lead us to an overall apologetic, a defense for Jesus as the Messiah, using philosophy, using truth, using God's existence, and then building a case that miracles are possible in this world as we know, and then looking at the reliability of Scripture through archaeology and through history, and ultimately leading us to the fact that there is a very high degree of certainty that Jesus is the Lord and Messiah of the whole universe. So before we do that, though, we have to look at what a worldview is. We all have a worldview. Everybody has a worldview. The question is your worldview, does it correspond to reality? So the true worldview must have explanatory power and scope to explain all the pieces of the puzzle that we call reality. So what must it explain? Well, number one, a true worldview must explain how the universe got here out of nothing. How did the universe get here? If you say there is no God, then your worldview must explain how the universe got here from nothing. The second thing a worldview must explain is the extreme fine-tuning of the universe. The universe is extremely fine-tuned. Number three, the origin of order and the four natural forces. The four natural forces, any physics nerds out there, you've got the strong force, the weak force, electromagnetism, and gravity. And what's interesting is that the strongest force is the force holding atoms and molecules together. And when you split the strong force, where do those forces come from? how does your worldview explain these four fundamental forces? And by the way, if any one of those four forces, physical forces, were changed to a minute degree, our universe could not exist. Why are these four fundamental forces tuned the way they are? How does your worldview explain it? If there is no God, then explain to me, pray tell, how this incredible fine-tuning, these physical parameters of the universe came into being. And we're just scratching the tip of the iceberg, to use a mixed metaphor. But it must explain the origin of the four natural forces and also the origin of reason and the laws of logic. Why is logic important? The origin of the laws of mathematics, the origin of objective morality that we talked about earlier. Where does this idea of right and wrong come from? Did the universe give it to us? Or why do we have this strong sense of injustice when something wrong is done? The origin and design of new life forms, and then the origin of intelligence or mind. Where does intelligence come from? Does it come from indifferent chance, or does it come from a mind itself? Can chance and disorder create a mind, or can only a mind create a mind? And then the origin of personality. So these are some of the things that a true worldview must explain. Now, the question that Francis Crick, who co-discovered the molecular structure of DNA, this is what he says about this idea, about meaning. He says, the astonishing hypothesis is that your joys, your sorrows, your memories, and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact more than the behavior of the vast assembly of nerves and cells and their associated molecules. So essentially, if there is no God, then really all you really are, according to Crick, is just the vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. And so that's the question, really big question, the $64 million question, is that right? Does he have that right? Are we just, if there is no God and there's no meaning, then all we are is just a bunch of molecules in motion. And that is, of course, not the view that we hold to. Well, before break, we're going to take a break here in just a moment, a little restroom break and a water break if you need water, restroom, and I'll be out at the table out here. But next session, in a couple of minutes, we're going to cover really some amazing evidence that God exists. Now, I know that you believe God exists, and I believe God exists. We believe this by faith, and we believe there's evidence for this. But I want to help you so that you can also be a case maker for people who don't believe in God, who believe that there is no God. And one of the things that amazed me when I got to meet several people in Chicago and also in New York is that a lot of people who identify as Jewish, you know what they are? They're atheists. I mean, they don't even believe in God. So how can they believe in the Messiah if they don't believe there's a God? So this is part of Jewish apologetics, really, is knowing how to defend God exists. Because Jesus, Yeshua, as God incarnate, that can't be true if there is no God. So from a logical apologetic standpoint, find out where people are on the spectrum. Are they denying truth? Are they denying God's existence? Do they think that the Bible has got errors in it? We're going to cover all that today. We've already just covered truth, and now you know how to deal with the idea that there's no such thing as truth. You can use the law of non-contradiction. You can apply a negative truth claim to itself. But basically, there are three essential religious worldviews. The first one is theism. Theism is the belief that God made everything in the world. And there are three major theistic religions in the world today: Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. Now, we have when you drill down into it, there are some differences in our understanding of the theistic God. But on a very bottom level, that all three faiths, Judaism, Islam, Christianity, we do believe that there is a God. We do disagree about the nature of God, especially with Islam, but the bottom line is we believe that there is a God. The second one is pantheism, essentially that God is everything. God is all. God is, the plants and the trees. Zen Buddhism, Hinduism, New Age, which is on the rise, by the way. New Ageism, we thought it was kind of gone away, but now it's coming back on the scene. But that God is everything. God is all. And then, of course, atheism. There is no God at all, or religious humanism. So the three major worldviews. So here's your first test for the day. Based on the law of non-contradiction, can they all be true? No, they cannot. They cannot all be true at the same time in the same sense. Now, they can touch on some similar truths, but they're actually, when you look at them, they're making contradictory truth claims. Because atheism says there is no God. So how can atheism be true and theism be true? Again, we go back to the law of non-contradiction. If the law of non-contradiction applies to reality, and it does, and we cannot make any rational sense without it, then there is evidence that there is a God. But if there's God, then atheism cannot be true. And if there is a God, if we establish theism, then by default, pantheism cannot be true and atheism cannot be true. It will rule out the other two automatically. So you don't even have to necessarily disprove everything about pantheism or Hinduism. All you have to do is establish that there is a God, that God exists. And if God exists, then you can look into the different claims of the three major faiths. So that is our goal for the next session. But the Bible does tell us, we're going to open with this slide, is that the heavens, of course, declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and his divine nature have been clearly understood, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. So with that, I will take just a couple of minutes for if you have any questions of what we talked about so far. I want this to be user-friendly, and if you have any stories to share or anything, let me know. So we'll take probably a 10-minute break. Is it okay, Rabbi Jeff? 10 minutes, restroom break. I will be on the table. I do have these booklets that I co-wrote with Ratio Christi team. It was actually my book, but if you would like to get a copy, just ask for a $10 donation. We take checks or cash. I do have a card reader. I think it will work, but I will be glad to sign it for you. But the other thing, too, is that if you want to sign up for Epic Archaeology updates and get updates about some of the latest discoveries of archaeology and stay up to date of what we're doing, and then later today I'll explain to you one of the archaeological projects that I've been working on for 12 years in eastern Turkey. Now, I've excavated in Israel, but my focus lately has been in eastern Turkey on the border of Iran and Syria. And in fact, my team is there today, and the reason why I'm not with them is because I'm with you. So I'd rather be with you. But they're on the border of northern Iraq in the Turkish city of Cizre, which is right near, interestingly, the city of Haran. Do you know who migrated to Haran? Abraham, the father of our faith. Abraham went to Haran. So my team is there now. So, but I will be going, Lord willing, in June next month, and I'll explain my mission for going to Turkey and what we've been working on and what we hope to discover. So, anybody have any questions or comments on truth or anything like that? Yes. Well, I would not call it an anomaly. I would call it sin nature, and it being manifest. It's being manifest. And what holds back evil today is the Holy Spirit and government, law. The God gave government the sword, as Paul said, the Apostle Paul said, the sword is not given to the government in vain. That he's there to uphold the law. But yes, I think I hear what you're saying. There are people today that are absolutely cruel, that do horrible things, and the sin nature is a terrible thing, and it can make people do horrible things. And in fact, Malcolm Muggeridge said years ago, he was a British newscaster who became a Christian. He said that fallen human nature is one of the most empirical facts of the Christian worldview. That we don't have to make, you can see it. You don't have to make the case that we are fallen. And that's the thing about humanity. But I would say that is par for the course. Yes, but it seems like that is increasing today, that cruelty. Are you talking about violence, just general violence? Wickedness. Oh, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And it's happening, and you're right. You see it more and more on the news. Of course, it seems like it's always happened, but It's more and more today. It seems more prevalent. Yes.
Truth is in creation and in the conscience that people have to work harder and harder to do more and more to kind of numb their conscience?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Great point. Because truth is in creation and in conscience. People, here's the crazy thing. I have been blessed to get to travel a lot, and I've been to Turkey now probably 5, 6 times. And the first time I went, I had never been, and I had about a 3-day layover in Istanbul, and I was staying there with some colleagues, and our team was meeting. We were going to fly further into Turkey, into eastern Turkey on the border of Armenia. So while I was there, I got to visit some sites, and I got to go to Hagia Sophia. So we're in Istanbul, which I learned is the largest city in Europe. It's 17 million people in Istanbul, larger than Paris, larger than London. I had no idea. So I'm on the train in Istanbul, and I'm looking over, because it's like so many people on the train. Like, I'm in Chicago, but this is on another level. I mean, there are literally, you're just body to body. And so everybody got their phone out, and I'm kind of looking over people's shoulder. You know what people are doing? Instagram, Facebook. So, I'm serious. Like, all these Turks, all these people from all over the world, everybody is in their phone around the world. You go to the airport. What are people doing? They're on their phone. Distraction, distraction, distraction. We're distracted with our gadgets, and we're not looking up at the stars. We're not looking at each other. We're not having conversation. We're not, So yeah, absolutely. I think people are distracted. Truth, and the one thing that Kierkegaard said this years ago, the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard said that if I could prescribe one thing for the world, it would be silence. Because when we're quiet, people cannot stand quiet because they're with their own thoughts. They hear the birds, they hear the water, and they don't like it because it reminds them, well, maybe there's a God. And I think that's where we are today, is we're distracted with noise and sound and our computers. But you were so absolutely right. And that filters into so many areas of this distracted age that we live in. Good point. Yes.
Do you have any hard copy on the content of all these slides?
I don't, but I can actually make a PDF of it with all the slides and give it to you. I think I'm going to give it to Ann, so she will actually get it.
Thank you.
And it's being recorded as well. Yes.
Those slides will be on our website. So.
Yes. A question in the back.
Yeah, I appreciate the line of thinking, and where I get lost is when I think about people who struggle with mental illness.
Yes.
And people who are just, we talk about the evil ones and the evil things that happen in the world, but when the brain isn't fully connecting properly and the heart isn't working just right, it leads to bad things.
Oh, yeah,
so
absolutely.
How do we put that into perspective?
Well, it actually falls into the umbrella of the fallen world that we live in. You said the world, what is a correct worldview had to explain? That wasn't it wasn't on there, but it should also explain evil and suffering in the world. If you're one of the biggest objections against Christianity and against God's existence is the problem of evil. Why is there evil in the world? And in fact, many Jews today, who elderly Jews, don't believe in God, because how could there be a God if He let this happen to us? He let the Holocaust happen, and so, but the problem of evil is not just a problem for Christians or people who believe in God. It's a problem for atheists as well. Because what you're saying is if there is no God, then there really is no ultimate meaning to that suffering. It was just complete meaningless suffering. But also mental illness as well. And not just mental illness, but cancer. Why do kids get cancer? And it's a little child. Why? And they die. Or parents, a mother and child, were killed in a car accident, and things like that, to take it in a more dark area. But mental illness, I would say, to answer it explicitly, what I would say is that God is just, and that He does not judge. He only judges people based on the knowledge that they have, and the mental capacity, and the spiritual capacity that they have. Like little children and people who have mental challenges, God has grace on them, and they will be, God will deal with them accordingly. But God is just and righteous, and He's good, and will by no means condemn, the innocent. So if they're innocent and they are mentally not able to process right and wrong, then I don't think they're culpable. That's my view of that. But yeah, hopefully to answer your question. Yeah. Any others? All right. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in about 10 minutes or so.